and welcome to Shankar IAS Academy's Daily Current Affairs Analysis, and today's date is 21/2/2026. Please like, comment, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit on the bell icon if you want to receive instant updates. And again, there's an announcement regarding our prelims fitness test series, the pre-fit of 2026. The date is on 20th February 2026. The batch starts. There's about 54 integrated tests, and this will help you aid your preparation. And there were about 31 questions that were directly reflected from the pre-fit test series of 2025, among which 20 questions were direct reflections and 11 questions were partial reflections in our pre-fit test series. And today's topic for the day, the first one is the oldest UNESCO World Heritage Site in India, and what were the oldest sites and why they are significant is what we are seeing. The second one is about the AI summit and the military AI, the guardrail. Why do we need to put a halt on the military AI and not get into any legally binding agreements? The third one is the evolution of justice and the lockup norms. Delhi Commissioner, what he has told, and what has happened and how is it different from the colonial era, and what happens in judicial custody is what we are talking. The fourth is about the need for diversity in the judiciary and a private member bill, and how the judges' case have come up and the NJAC, which was struck down, and again going back to the collegium system, and how today the representation and inclusivity should be there and why there is no equity. And the fifth topic is the prelims focus for the day. So today's first topic of the day is about the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in India, and there are a lot of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and today we are going to decode one by one, which is important to the UPSC perspective. So the first slide is about the Bhimbetka cave. The Bhimbetka cave. Bhimbetka, the name itself comes from Bhima. Bhima, the second Pandava brother, he is believed in Mahabharata to take his abode. He is believed to have rested in this cave in Madhya Pradesh, Bhopal, which is why this cave got the name as Bhimbetka cave. This is in Madhya Pradesh, in Bhopal. It is a Mesolithic site, and here we have the oldest evidence of human life in the Indian subcontinent. Why do we think this is the oldest evidence? Because this is where we found the oldest paintings, the oldest habitation of humans, but also there is one important unknown, lesser known fact that is present here, that is the migration pattern. That is, in this cave, if you see, you find African rocks, which is believed that there were African people who were living here from the migrated area. They've migrated to India and they were living here, which is why this is one of the oldest evidence. It also shows migration patterns. And the highlight is there are hunting scenes, animals, community life painted with natural pigments. The natural pigments were white and red in color. The color came from hematite. And now we have finished this. We have come to the painting part. You see, this is the painting. Now this painting also shows one important thing. There were also paintings that were superimposed, meaning one painting over other. Why do we have superimposed paintings? Why did they paint one painting over other? This was because of the communication angle. They wanted to communicate to one another. So one person would paint and he would leave. The other person would respond with painting again. So it was painting over painting. There were superimposed paintings. Now, is there only one cave as such? And is it only in India is the question. In that pointer, we would understand that there are other caves like this. Significantly, the Lascaux cave in France and the Altamira cave in Spain. So in the year 2002, Bhimbetka was a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and one important thing is, if in prelims they ask a question saying there is a wildlife sanctuary passing through the Bhimbetka caves, or the Bhimbetka cave is near a wildlife sanctuary, it is in a wildlife sanctuary, the statement is absolutely right, because you have to remember the Ratapani Wildlife Sanctuary. So these are some of the important factors, important pointers that you have to remember when you're talking about the Bhimbetka cave. The next is the Dholavira. The Dholavira is near the Mansar and Manhar river, present in the Kadirbeth. So where is Kadirbeth present, and why is this region very arid? Because it is present in Gujarat, arid zone. That's why even from the pictures you can find out that this is construction that was in a arid zone. So this is in Gujarat, Ran of Kutch, as already stated in Kadirbeth. This period is during the Indus Valley Civilization, 3000 to 1500 BCE. It had an advanced urban planning because it had a three-part structure. What does three-part structure mean? It had an upper town, it had a middle town, it had a lower town. Usually there are two parts, citadel and the lower town. But here there were three parts, the upper, the middle, the lower. So three-part structure is present in Dholavira, one important factor again for prelims. Sophisticated water reservoirs, because water reservoirs were carved out of rock itself. Carved out of rock itself. It had a grid layout like this. So the grids were like this. It had a drainage system. The drains were cleanable. And it demonstrates scientific town planning in urban ecology and in an arid region, because the town planning was in such a way that it was a predecessor to water conservation, which is why in Gujarat even today in the contemporary age you see that there are a lot of step wells. So how important is town planning in arid ecology is one more thing that we have to remember. Next is the Sanchi Stupa. The Sanchi Stupa has three parts. Very, very importantly, the Harmonica, the umbrella-like structure, the Chatra, and the Anda. The Anda is named after Mount Meru. What is Mount Meru? Mount Meru in Buddhist psychology talks about, in Buddhist philosophy, it talks about the spine of life, the place where a lot of gods rest, and it is believed that that is the spine of life. That is why this Sanchi Stupa was built based on the belief of Mount Meru. And the square-like structure you see here is called as the Harmonica, and the umbrella-like structure that you see here is called as the Chatra. Now, this is the Sanchi Stupa, the early Buddhist architecture. The location is in Madhya Pradesh, and this was during the Mauryan era. The patron was Emperor Ashoka. It is one of the earliest surviving Buddhist structure. It is important to remember that Shunga dynasty was the one which decorated the Toranas and Harmonicas. Even though this was during the Mauryan age and Emperor Ashoka was the one who wanted to do this, the elaborate gateways, the Toranas and the Harmonicas were developed and were decorated by the Shungas. It marks the spread of Buddhism as an organized religion. Buddhism became an organized religion only after the Sanchi Stupa. Before that, it was not as prevalent and as organized as before the Sanchi Stupa. So this is something that we have to remember. The Sanchi Stupa is one of the earliest Buddhist architecture. It was in the year 1983 that it got the UNESCO World Heritage Site, UNESCO tag. So next is about the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya. The first pointer is, it is one of the oldest brick temple. The king Sangamitra was a patron because he took the branch of the Bodhi tree to Anantapura, his capital, and this is on the bank of the river Niranjana. So, three important pointers to remember. It is in the bank of the river Niranjana. Sangamitra was a patron and he took the Bodhi tree's branch to Anantapura, and this is one of the oldest serving brick temples in India. So, where is it located? It is located in Bihar, and 3rd century BCE origins. It is a later Gupta era structure. This was a site where Buddha attained enlightenment and is very, very significant. And this is one of Buddhism's holiest pilgrimage centers globally around the world. So this is about the Mahabodhi temple, and the last one is Rakigiri. If they ask you in prelims that Rakigiri is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, no. It is a tentative UNESCO World Heritage Site. That is very, very important to remember. Where is it located? On the banks of Gagar Hakra river. You see there are multiple mounds, burial mounds found here, and there were a lot of DNA studies happening in Rakigiri. So, three important pointers. One is the DNA studies that you have to remember. Two is it is in the bank of Gagar Hakra river, and the third one is there are a lot of burial mounds that were found in this particular site. Now, you see this is Rakigiri. It has a lot of bricks, brick-like structure. The proportion is 1:2:4. The brick size was 1:2:4. And this is located in Haryana. Already we have seen that it is in the bank of the Gagar Hakra, and it's in the mature Harappan phase. It expands the understanding of the Indus Valley civilization because this was one of the areas where there was proto-industrial zoning, meaning the industry zones or the factory zones were differentiated from the other areas. That's why this is very important. It had proto-industrial zoning, and the urban settlement remains. The seals and the burial practices all differentiate this particular area, and henceforth this is very, very important to remember. Now, the prelims practice question with reference to the earliest World Heritage Sites inscribed from India by UNESCO, which of the following correctly distinguishes the sites that were included in the first batch? So there are four options. They were confined to a single state of India. No. They were exclusively natural heritage sites. No. It was not exclusively only for natural heritage sites. They consisted of ancient Hindu temple architecture and only, no, extreme statement, no. They included both Buddhist cave complexes because 1983, you remember the Sanchi Stupa, and a Mughal architecture monument. So the answer should be option A. Let's check. Yes, the answer is option A. With this, we come to the end of the first topic and we move to the second topic for the day. So AI is booming in the world, and today AI summits are happening all over the world. Even though if it's not globally, it is happening even inside the state, even inside the country. And now India is hosting one of the biggest AI summits. And with that, there was one particular realm that we have to talk about, the military guardrails, military AI. How do we use AI in military? And is it something that is viable? It's a question. Now let's move into today's topic. So, the headline, that is, we have to balance innovation with the accountability factor. Why should we do that? The core argument is that the military AI should be a non-binding framework. We do not need a binding treaty. And why is that? Because India states that when we have a non-binding framework is when we can actually experiment with innovation and technology entirely, because it is too premature for us to have a binding agreement. And if you have a binding agreement, it would freeze the innovation and it would create technological divide, and it would widen the global AI divide, is what India is saying. So India is saying that we should allow all countries, all states to experiment with their AI and find their own model. So that is why India supports a normative, non-binding global framework instead of an immediate treaty. India considers this binding instrument that all people are talking about as something that is very, very important to remember with the accountability. The accountability of the lethal autonomous weapon system. What is the lethal autonomous weapon systems? When you talk about weapons, when they can launch themselves, when they can automatically respond to a situation without human interference, automated, basically automated without human interference. So these lethal autonomous weapon systems are the premature, are in the premature stage, and to put a binding framework on them will be very difficult, is what India is saying. But when India is saying this, there is also an ethical question. Now let's imagine that there is a drone that is attacking a country, or imagine that there is a drone that is actually launched, and it is just done for practice, but it is going to harm a particular area. You will not be able to stop it because this is completely automated, and that's why India wants to put a hold on this. And it wants to actually experiment with the evolving nature, but then also take accountability factor for it. The goal is to ensure that global rules do not hinder the indigenous technology production, that is the in-country technology production. The experimenting with it should not be hindered and should not be affected because the global framework or the global norms is what it's trying to say. And this, if at all we put a binding framework, this will actually hinder the progress and this will create a AI divide, is what it's saying. Now, human in the loop. At the heart of India's stance, there is a necessity for human control. There is a necessity for human control over lethal use of force, because you have to have human control to actually stop it. If you need to stop it, if you want to launch it, you should have the human control. And the state's responsibility, even in a non-binding setup, this is very, very important to remember. Even in a non-binding setup, India pushes for principles where states remain accountable for the actions of AI systems under international humanitarian law. And just because it's AI, you cannot take away humanity factor here, and that's why it's important to be in accordance with the humanitarian law, is what the state's responsibility is saying, and understandable by design. See, the own governance guidelines that we have emphasize that the accountability should be assigned based on function, based on risk, and based on due diligence. And India was among the countries like US and China. India also did not want to sign this particular deal. The Pathways to Action Declaration, it did not want to sign this. The 2026 REAM Summit. What is REAM? Responsible AI in the military domain. The REAM Summit, the reasoning is that India wants to have a middle path. It does not want to have extremes. It wants a middle path, and it supports responsible use, but it does not want restricted compliance heavy methodology that is imposed on us because of the global framework. If there are mandatory approvals or licensing, then it will be very, very difficult for us to experiment with it. The Article 51, the DPSP Article 51 also talks about promoting international peace and security. So while doing it, we also want to safeguard our national interest. So for the balanced AI framework, you can also state this as an example or as a concluding factor when you write your mains answer. That is, India is going for a balanced framework, a middle path, because it aligns with the directive principles of state policy. And the dual use challenge. AI is dual use. A strict military ban could stifle civilian innovations in healthcare, in logistics, and in disaster responses. But there is also an ethical dilemma. This is in GS4. If an autonomous drone misidentifies a target, who is liable? The accountability gap. The accountability gap that we have to bridge can be used as a challenge when you write your mains answer in GS3 or GS2, and the ethical dilemma can be used in GS4 when you write your accountability gap based answers in AI. So, with this, we have come to the prelims practice question. The Responsible AI in Military Domain Summit is primarily meant to negotiate and implement legally binding international treaties banning all AI in defense systems. Wrong. Establish a single global governance body for military AI development. No. Bring together military, academic, and policy leaders to discuss ethical use of artificial intelligence in defense and security. Seems somewhat right, so we'll keep this on hold. And promote the exclusive use of civilian AI technologies in warfare. This is absolutely wrong. So, because nothing else is closer to the question, the answer should be option B. Let's check. Yes, the answer is the option B. With this, we have come to the end of the second topic for the day and we move to the third topic. So, the next topic of the day talks about something very, very significant in the evolution of justice. So, being in prison, being put in prison is something that has been prevalent from the colonial era. But today, even in today's time, there have not been various significant changes that have happened. Of course, we are trying to change the colonial era's practices and we are breaking free from them. One of the significant aspects we can talk about is the changing of the name of the Indian Penal Code. But today, again, there are a lot of changes that we have spoken about, and how the humane treatment should be there in prisons, because that is a place for somebody to change, not a place for somebody to be, again, psychologically put down, is what we are talking about in this article. So let's decode the analysis of the Delhi Police new standing order. It talks about the lockup facilities and it talks about broadcast and high impact detention. The police commissioner has issued a standing order on 13 February 2026 and he mandates humane standards in police lockups. He says that the police lockup should have proper standards of habitation, and amid scrutiny, there have been about 29 custodial deaths that have been reported, and we don't know how much is not reported. There have been 29 deaths that were reported in the last 5 years in Delhi. So the shift in power dynamics, why? First, when you see the first pointer here talks about the colonial era. The colonial era where prisons were a place for suppression. You take the Blackwater jail, you take a lot of jails, they were created for the suppression of people. They were created for the control of subjects. So when both of them were there, these prisons were a place for agony. They were not a place for change. And that's why modern democratic policing should evolve towards service, protecting the citizens, and being a place for change. So the ideologies, Michael Foucault, he talks about discipline and punish. He says that there has been, you have put a person in jail because that person has done something wrong. Is it not unfair on your part to again physically put him down by not giving humane condition, is what he talks. He says that the humane condition should be maintained and we should regulate the system. The second is Cesar Beccaria. Cesar Beccaria talks about the deprivation of liberty. He says that putting in lockup is enough. Now you are violating the proportionality of justice. And what does proportionality of justice means? It simply means that the crime that you do and the punishment should be equal. You cannot, if somebody takes a 5 rupee chocolate from a shop, let's say, and then you give him 5-year sentence for the 5 rupee chocolate, that is something that does not match the crime. The proportionality is very massively different. So it says that it violates the proportionality of justice. And this Cesar Beccaria is somebody who has studied classical criminology very, very detailedly. And now the present rule, when you come to the prelims focus of the mains point, the present emphasis is that they have given a fixed per detainee diet amount. That diet should be given to each person. Safe drinking water should be given at all times, and functional washrooms and running water should be present. The medical examination should be there at all times of arrest, and today every 48 hours the person is medically monitored, and it's seen if he is actually okay. If he's seriously ill or if she is seriously ill, the shift to hospital should be present, and medical records are mandatory. The why. See, under trial, when people are under trial, they say that you are innocent until you are proven guilty. So these people are technically, legally innocent. So for them, these subhuman conditions, that is no running water, extreme temperatures, the extrajudicial pre-trial punishment. So this will violate the core ethic of justice. So this should not be done. And totalitarian institutions, when we talk about totalitarian institutions, there is a lot of pressure involved there. The prisons, the penitentiaries, they all have a lot of pressure in them. So the rate of suicide, the rate of psychological harm, the rate of people wanting to actually take away their life or harm themselves is high. So when you condition them to subhuman terms, the subhuman treatment, the feeling is only aggrieved. So you have to actually have a proper treatment mechanism so they do not psychologically degrade themselves. So these temperature control, proper bedding, and proper emphasis on that is a buffer against the psychological degradation, is what they're saying. Now the gap between the mandate and the implementation. What's the gap? The first one is the DK Basu guidelines. It focused on procedural guidelines. It said that relatives should be informed if you're arresting a person, and 48 hours every once they have to be monitored. The officer who's arresting the person should have his name badge right there, so the person who's being arrested knows who arrested the person. There should be proper memo. These are things that was in the DK Basu guidelines. DK Basu was a state of Bengal, the case judgment. Now with the Golcha order, which is present, he talks about the material infrastructural rights that the arrestee is having. The constraint is that the sensitization bottleneck, because when you have a top-down order, maybe the IPS officers, the DSPs, the commissioners, they would understand this particular thing, but when it goes down to the bottom, the constables or people who are at the bottom level, they see that this is a way of coddling the prisoners. This is the way of coddling people in trial. You should not be doing that, and they should be given strict treatment is there. So people should uniformly be advised about how to treat the people who are under trial is the second one. The third one is the ethical implication, that is, the state is the ultimate custodian. If a person is incapacitated by the state and the physical well-being is not taken care of, then the state should be accountable, because the state is arresting, so the state is responsible, is what they are saying. And negligence is the a violation of a social contract. Now, state lawlessness versus public trust. Custodial death will represent the ultimate betrayal of social contract. So when the protector, when the policemen, when people who are supposed to protect, they became the predators, then it is going to be very, very difficult for us to actually have a democratic authority, and this will erode public trust. So Upendra Bakshi, the professor, he says that this phenomenon is states' lawlessness. See, when law enforcement agencies themselves violate law. Let's take the case of a lot of custodial deaths that are present. When things like that happen, this will have a crisis for the constitution. So procedural safeguards like memos and judicially having them in loop without any judicial oversight should be there. So this we have already seen. DK Basu was a state of West Bengal, the mandated police identification that we have spoken about, and Nilavati Behera was a state of Orissa. This case talks about the custodial deaths, and it talks about the Supreme Court wanting people to have access to their rights, their constitutional rights, and in case their rights are violated, they are entitled to compensation, is what this particular case talks about. So now, why this constitutional failure happens? Why are these bad apples there? Why are these custodial deaths there? Because they want a quick confession. They want this person to agree to what he has done, that if it's wrong. So there is immense pendency, political pressure, and a lack of forensic infrastructure. So people are actually beating up people in trial. They're actually using medieval methods. So actually have a govern to actually get out information. This is what results in custodial. This is what relates in custodial deaths. And David Bailey states that Indian police structure retains its colonial DNA even today because it is designed to force or subjugate its people rather than actually doing it as a service, is what he says. And the administrative constraint is that if the states do not implement the police complaints authority, he creates a vicious cycle of impunity where the police ends up investigating the police. That's what he says. So these mandatory inspections, documented chain of custody should be there. When you mandate all the physical amenities that are there, the heaters, the clean water, the running water, the use of washrooms, then it is verifiable on paper trial, and you cannot easily hide torture and medical negligence when physical conditions and medical checks are logged properly. So you have to maintain a logbook, is what they're saying. And it shifts the administrative burden. Instead of reacting after a death with NHRC inquiry, they will actually have closed the blind spots that are present with respect to the government. So the custody terminology, this is a prelims pointer. The article specifically mentions police custody and lockups. Judicial custody and police custody, what is the difference? In judicial custody, when you are in central or state prison and the judiciary has put you in it, a police officer cannot come investigate you without the written consent of the magistrate or the judiciary. But when you are in police custody, maximum 15 days, you can be in the police station and the police can interrogate directly. So this is the difference and this is the clarification you have to remember for the prelims point of view. So we have come to the prelims practice question for the day with reference to the police custody and constitutional safeguards in India. Consider the following statement. A person in police custody is legally presumed innocent until proven guilty. Yes. The Supreme Court in D.K. Basu was the state of West Bengal laid down procedural safeguards against custodial abuse. Yes. Judicial custody allows police to interrogate the accused without prior permission of the magistrate. No, they need a written consent. So statement 3 is wrong. So the answer should be option C, 1 and 2 only. Let's check. Yes, the answer is option C, 1 and 2 only. With this, we have come to the end of this topic and we move to the next topic for the day. So we have come to the main topic for the day. The main topic of the day talks about the inclusivity in judiciary, and let's dive into the topic and decode it. So recently, there was a private member bill by the DMK MP, P. Wilson. He introduced a constitutional amendment bill. He stated that there is a lack of social diversity in the judiciary and that people from all sections of the society, the OBCs, women, SC, ST, everybody should be constituting equally in the judicial process. So he stated that they should be appointed from various social backgrounds. The argument is that the current system, the current judicial system, it lacks adequate representation for all the ST, STs, OBCs and women. So the proposed mechanism, he states that there should be a more transparent and inclusive appointment process that reflects the pluralistic nature, because India is a diverse country and people are from various backgrounds, or also all social backgrounds should be adequately represented, is what he's saying. Now the collegium system. So the collegium system was something that came into accord, and there were 4 judge cases. The first judge cases was the one wherein you have the concurrence. The word concurrence and consultation. There was a debate. So at one point, when the president is appointing the Chief Justice of India, it was said that when he is consulting, the consulting of the previous Chief Justice, does that mean that just consulting and doing as per the president wishes, or if the CJI is saying somebody's name, should the president actually appoint that person? So in the first judge's case, it was stated that it is not very, very important. If consultation just means talking to that person and appointing whoever the president wishes. The second judge's cases, it meant the consultation meant that being concurrent with it. So whoever the CJI says, then that person should be appointed. Now the second judge's case, then came the third judge's case. In the third judge's case, people told that there was not adequate representation. Earlier there were only CJI and 2 additional people. So now we want more people to be there. So they said CJI plus 4 people should be there to actually choose the next CJI. So this happened, and then in the fourth judge's case, there was the NJAC, the National Judicial Appointments Commission, which came into accord. So, to the second judge's case, as already stated, the consultation meant concurrence, and by preventing favoritism, they wanted a single individual aimed with merit and independence. So this happened. The four judges case came into accord. Then in 2015, the National Judicial Appointment Commission came. Now, NJSC violated the basic structure of the constitution, because you see, whenever we draw this diagram, the executive and the legislature is always intertwined and the judiciary is always alone. Although there is an integrated judiciary framework from top to bottom, but there is always the role of the executive and the legislature is independent from the judiciary. But the National Judicial Appointments Commission actually stated that 2 members, the law minister and 2 eminent persons, they will be there in accordance to talk about the appointment of the CJI and the other judges. So when this happened, there was a big hassle, because they thought that the basic structure doctrine of the people is the people in the judiciary is affected. The veto concern. So in NJSC, there are 4, if there are 5 members and 2 people think that this particular person should not come into accord, then that person's candidature will be cancelled. So again, this veto power is something that's alarming. Take the case of A and Ray. Take the case of Justice Khanna to Beg being the CJI. These are all violations. These are all violations that happened when they should have become the CJI using the seniority principle. They were not given that particular realm. They were not given that particular accord. So the veto power will actually create some kind of corruption and bias, is what they were saying. And the separation of powers. The court maintained the independent judiciary, and it said that it is essential for democracy and the executive should have a hand in the pie at selecting who might sit in the judgment of government actions. So this independent judiciary is the only thing that is actually protecting the constitutional values. So even if in that particular realm there is the executive and the legislative action, then it's going to be very difficult. It's what it's saying. Now, the regional benches of the Supreme Court, like cities like Chennai, Mumbai, Kolkata, they are long-standing in decentralizing justice. If there is a litigant from south or northeast, he must travel to Delhi to go to the Supreme Court, and it has massive travel costs and pay for Delhi-based senior advocates, making the Supreme Court inaccessible to the poor. So accessibility factor is also very, very important for us to address. And regional benches bring the higher court closer to people, fulfilling the principle that justice should be available at everybody's doorstep. You are a Tamilian, or you might be a Malayali, you might be a Telugu speaking person, but then it should be accessible to everybody. Geographic equity should be there. Reducing pendency. By splitting the court into a constitutional bench and several appellate benches, the court should handle routine appeals more efficiently and reduce the backlog of cases. Even today, we see there are a lot of backlog of cases and a lot of cases which are not being accounted properly. So that should be put in accord. The legitimacy factor. That is, it should be independent from political pressure, it should be socially representative, it should be transparent in appointments, and it should be accessible to citizens are the four legitimacy factors that we talk about. A judiciary that is independent but socially detached has a moral distance. So it should be independent, but also it should be socially inclusive to all people from all the realms. And the judiciary should be representative, but it should not risk capture. The solution is in institutional redesign. It's not in ideological extremes. The debate will also reflect tension between independence and diversity. The idea that law is interpreted by a body that understands lived realities. Who gave lived realities? It's the thinker Dorothy Smith. Lived realities of all sections of populations. Lived realities meaning what is in the book will always be different from what is actually going on with people. So the lived realities, how people live it, live the reality, and how people actually are in that situation. It should be, the idea should capture that particular thing. So now the mains practice question, the debate on judicial appointments in India reflects a tension between judicial independence and social diversity. In this context, so here you can do a hub-spoke model. In this context, critically examine the evolution of the collegium system. Here you can talk about the judge's case. The striking down of the NJC, the veto power, the legislature and executive interference and factors, and the need for reforms to enhance the legitimacy to access to justice, because unequal access and equity model. So you can actually use this as 3 pages, first for this, and then the collegium system and the NJAC in the second page, and the reforms in the third page. With this, we have come to the end of the mains practice question for the day. Please send us your answer copies so that we can actually help you better in your preparation and aid you better. With this, we have come to the end and we are moving to the prelims focus for the day. Now we have come to the prelims focus for the day. The first topic is about UPI One World. So NPCI is extending UPI One World. What is UPI One World? It is a wallet service for foreign visitors from over 40 countries attending the AI Impact Summit for them to use UPI. It is developed by NPCI. It allows international travelers to use UPI for any payment in India. This is through a preloaded wallet while linking them to international accounts. This is person to merchant real-time payment accord to help them is what they've done. This is a very, very significant initiative. We can use this in any mains answer. We can also use this in prelims. So this is very, very significant. The second one is why plants flower more on the sunlit side. Light and photosynthesis. Sunlit leaves produce more energy, supporting buds and fruits. Yes, this we have learned even when we were very young. And shaded leaves make less energy, causing fewer flowers and drop fruits. So well-lit leaves will trigger more flowering, and shaded leaves will actually grow shoots and leaves instead of flowers. So flowers need more sunlight for them, and the temperature and water balance. Water speeds bud growth, but increased water needs. Lack of water will limit photosynthesis. So water is also needed for photosynthesis, and light, wherever there is light, there are more flowers is what the basic one line of this article is. The Rashtranayak Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Yuva Bharat is to organize Jai Shivaji Jai Bharat at a historical satra on Shivaji Jayanti. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj was born in this day in 1630s. He pioneered in guerrilla warfare methods referred to as Shiva Shutra. In 1674, it was formally crowned as Chhatrapati, the monarch of his Raigad's territory, and he promoted the use of Sanskrit and Marathi rather than Persian in his court administration. He built a strong navy to protect Goa and the Konkan coast, and he was a scholar in Sanskrit and 8 other languages. He was also a poet. This is basically about the Marathas, and with regard to the Marathas, the Chhatrapati Shivaji. So today the prelims question is with reference to Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Consider the following statements. He introduced a system of Ashtapada, Council of 8 Ministers for Administrative Governance. Yes, right. His revenue system was directly based on the subsystem of the Mughal Empire without modifications. No, there were a lot of modifications. He emphasized a strong naval force to protect the western coast of India. Yes. So which of the statements given above are incorrect? So incorrect is only one, that is option 2. So the answer should be B, option 2. Let's check. Yes, the answer is B, option 2. With this, we have come to the end of today's video. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thank you for watching your video.